is a quiz. A student misses question 1, they get a 9 out of 10. IRATs are meant to establish kind of that initial understanding of a student before we get into the peer teaching of the TRAT or the application activities that follow in a team-based learning model. What confidence-based testing essentially says is if we are really meaning to use this IRAT as an initial assessment or an initial look at how those students are performing on a quiz, then shouldn't we give them the opportunity to reflect on that learning and maybe to show us a little bit more about how they are looking at these questions or how they are learning things. And essentially, what this proposes is that we're eliminating the effect of random guesses because we should be able to see how a student rationalizes their answers within a multiple choice quiz. And a little bit more about that theory is, a student should be able to allocate points or essentially weigh their answers or weigh their decision making on different options on that multiple choice quiz. What this looks like in practice is the easiest way to think about this is for each question a student gets 4 points. So if we're looking at a multiple choice question with 4 potential answers, the student gets 4 points to use on that question. And what they do is the more confident they are in their answer, the more points or the more weight they put in that answer. And based off of this, InteDashboard codes this, but this is actually based on some work through UCLA here in the States, where we can see based off how a student weighs or distributes those points and the correct answer or the wrong answer of that question, whether a student is moving towards mastery of a concept or if they're completely guessing. And I know right now we're talking the abstract. I have some specific examples of some questions that will show you students doing this. But what this kind of proposes, and what I think each of us has experience of as educators, is sometimes I get students who I know don't know the content of my quizzes, but they still perform okay. And I know if I would sit down with that student and I would actually ask them that much of their performance or much of their success might be based on successful guessing, or we often say in the States, an educated guess, right? Where they know a little bit about the information, enough to clarify or to guess correctly. But if you actually ask, like, do you understand this concept? Students often say, no, I was guessing based off of context clues or what I thought I knew. And ultimately, remember, what we're trying to get our students towards is this idea of mastery rather than guesses or misinformation, which you'll see here on this table. Misinformation is when a student is very confident in their answer, but they are absolutely wrong. So a good example of this is for those of you with kids, is when you are trying to argue with a child and they believe above all else that the sky outside is yellow because they're learning their colors. Now, they are absolutely wrong in the fact that the sky is yellow, but they are very confident in that fact. And so that is an example of a misinformation mistake versus mastery would be the sky is blue. I know it is blue because, and the confidence aligns with the correct answer there. And we're not going to get into the complications of you arguing, well, the sky is sometimes yellow in the sunset. Because we'll see how a student actually taking this quiz can show that maybe they're trying to argue a finer point there. And that's confidence versus students being crafty. And there's actually a mechanism in InteDashboard that allows them to submit those clarifications as well. So what's this look like when a student is taking the quiz? So the platform itself, I'll be honest. Now, Shreya, close your ears. The InteDashboard quiz taking platform is nothing special when you look at it from a student perspective, right? It is an online quiz platform, right? This is what the students see. They have a timer on the top. They have their questions. But what I want to really clue you into is you'll notice on the far left of this question that you'll notice that 4 next to the A. And what that is showing is that student has put all 4 of their points associated with this question on option A. And to me, this shows that that student is very confident in that answer because they're saying, I bet all 4 points on this question that A is the correct answer. A student has the option, and you'll see there's that plus arrow and that minus arrow to add or subtract based off of how confident they are. So it is within a student's right to distribute their points any way they see fit, based on what they know, what they think, and they can leave zeros on any option that they know or they believe to know is wrong. And so that's the biggest difference with confidence-based testing versus a normal testing scenario, is students get these points to distribute based off of how confident they are. Something I should have mentioned earlier is this confidence-based testing is optional on the InteDashboard platform. So you do not have to leave this turned on all the time. And there are certainly some situations where I think it's very appropriate to include kind of this metacognitive process in your testing, and other instances where it might not be appropriate. For instance, I had a colleague who once did confidence-based testing on a midterm, and that was a mess because she really struggled then to show, like, what do they actually know? Like, that's a very more definitive thing. Confidence-based testing really works best, and that's why it's often used in a team-based learning scenario for when students are still struggling or learning through the content or still kind of defining or clarifying things. So it is an optional structure of InteDashboard, but I really think it benefits this kind of team-based learning mechanism within the platform. So here's another option, and again, this is the same kind of idea, but here you'll see that this student distributed their points across all the options. Now, what do you think an educator or a teacher can assume if a student spreads their points on all the options of a multiple choice question? What do you think we see? This is what the student sees when they're taking the quiz and they answer this way, but what do we think that we can kind of glean from that? Oh, and I see a chat participation. A guess, right? So this is a student saying, you know, especially if these are worth points, actual course points. Usually when a student spreads their points, that's them making a calculated decision that says, well, I don't know the answer, but I know if I spread all my points this way, I'll at least get 1/4 of it correct, right? Now, I like to say I love it when students guess on questions because that actually teaches me a lot about what they know, right? Students who guess do not know the right answer. If they did, they would have selected it. And that shows me that they are doing a calculated move of guessing rather than missing a question. And I think that teaches us something a little bit different about students. And so I definitely think that this gives us as educators an opportunity to get into the minds of our students a little bit further. And students like this, because even if I'm guessing, I say, well, I can at least get, 1/4 of the points on this question, right? And so I think that allows students, it's kind of like it's the carrot or the stick, or it's the reward that comes with maybe the punishment of like digging into their minds a little bit more, because this does give them an opportunity to maybe earn a little bit more credit for an assignment than they would have if this was an all or nothing question and they guessed incorrectly. So I mentioned each of these things, but here's a slide that kind of talks about it a little bit further. So for the students, what I just mentioned is this does allow students, if you want, of course, this is something you could choose to ignore, but if you want, this allows students to receive partial scores. And I'll show you what that looks like a little bit, but on a quiz that is worth 10 points, for instance, what that means is students can get 0.25 points for questions if you give them 4 options and they kind of split answers. So they can end up getting half points on a question or 0.25 on a question. It also really encourages them to reflect too, right? I think we often take for granted when students just select an option on a multiple choice quiz Like, are they actually thinking about why they selected that option, or are they just answering and moving on, right? And so having them distribute points really forces them to think about their answers. And the last thing is this confidence-based testing, it lives in those individual assessments, okay? And then when we follow that with a team-based assessment, what might happen is perhaps Shreya and I are on the same team. And Shreya says, you know, I split my choices between A and B. And then I say, well, I put all of my points in A, and I'm confident. And then Shreya knows, oh, good, I at least could figure out those two options. And so that helps to facilitate a little bit more conversation between students versus when students just answer blindly without maybe this opportunity. It kind of discourages a little bit of conversation, because Shreya might say, I answered B, and I say, I answered A. And we're immediately at odds with each other, right? We have different answers, whereas distributing the points allows a little bit more conversation. And then I'm actually going to show you a little bit more about what the instructor's side looks like and why I think that this might be really valuable for instructors too. So students like it because they can get some more points, and it forces them into a little bit more conversation. But we like it because it shows us things like this. None of you knew, we're all in different time zones right now, so I apologize. This is either late evening or early evening diabetes therapeutics, which none of you agreed or signed on for. But this is a question from one of my classes, which is asking students to understand the diabetes therapeutic recommendations for patients and their A1C goal. This is actually a relatively difficult concept for my students to understand, because what's important here is that we're talking about an older patient, and my students learned the goals for a young patient, but an older patient changes those goals. And so students often get really confused about that change because they learn it one way, and then I say, well, this is an older patient, now you have to relearn it a different way. And you can actually see on the results on the right, this is what you see on InteDashboard for student performance on question 5, which is this question. You'll see this yellow student, they put 3 points on B, 1 point on C, and the correct answer was C. And so what that shows me is this student kind of thought that they were between 7.5 and 8% for their answers. They ultimately weighted their answer incorrectly, right? But that shows me that A was not a good distractor, and D was not a good distractor for their student. And so their confusion lies between choosing between 7.5 and 8. And this is something that I know to be true, is I know that there are some instances where that decision actually changes if we're looking at a patient scenario. And so as an educator, I can look at a student who's answered that way and think, oh, I bet that you were confused on this subject matter because of this thing, right? Versus if they had just missed it, I might just think, well, I'm not sure why you chose that answer. I can't see into your thinking. You'll see this red option here. This is a student who put all their eggs or all their choices in one basket. They chose D. That is an incorrect answer. So this is an example of a student who has a misunderstanding. They thought that they were confident. They picked D. They were confident in the wrong answer. And then we see 4 students who successfully put all of their points in the right answer. So let me show you another example of what this could look like. Here's another example. We're getting more advanced as we talk this evening, but this is melanoma treatment, okay? And so here we see a student, that yellow student with their 1 split across. What's that mean? Looks like this student's guessing. They honestly don't know. They're distributing their points. We see the second student split their answer between C and D. The third student incorrectly was confident in option D. And then the last 2 students correctly got C. And so you can see how A and B are probably not my best distractors. And it looks like where the most confusion is happening for my students is between options C and options D. The reason this is valuable for us as educators is Let's imagine that after the students take these quizzes, I only have 30 minutes to clarify concepts. Depending on your quiz, we all know it can be really tough, especially if students don't perform well on a quiz. It can be tough to decide, okay, I only have so much time to clarify that content or to really dig deep into a subject matter. How do I decide where to focus, right? Especially if you're using something like a paper quiz that might not be graded right away. It's really hard to flip through those really quickly and be like, okay, I have 30 minutes to elaborate on something. How do I decide? This platform actually shows you this information as students are answering the quiz. And so while students are working on their quiz, I can start to say, okay, question 5 performed poorly. It looks like, based off of this platform's kind of analysis of the options, that students, when they knew something about this subject, guessed between C or D. D was my best distractor because students were either confident in answering that wrong or they split their decision between C and D. So if I'm going to spend anywhere talking about like what I should clarify, I don't have to spend time on option A here. I can spend time talking about the difference between options C and D with my students. And that helps to heighten in and really address students where they are in their learning, rather than kind of blindly guessing and deciding what I want to talk about without any like supportive statistics. Students interact with the clicking relatively easy. I'll say that the biggest thing that I run into issues with students using that is we don't tell them ahead of time that they get to do that confidence thing. And you'll notice that if you don't distribute your points entirely, it kind of stops you and it says, hey, make sure you distribute your points. And so I think that the biggest thing that is difficult with using this is getting students used to the idea that they get to distribute their points themselves. And so again, just we're belaboring the point, but I think that it's important is this screen is kind of what you see at the end when you're done with your quiz. But this is ultimately maybe what that performance will look like when you have a whole class in this platform. I believe these are just made up names, so we can laugh or we can jolly with their performance. But you can actually see, for instance, question 3 looks like one where most of the students were quite confident. I don't see a lot of issues. That's not somewhere where I would spend a lot of time clarifying student concerns. Whereas something like question 8, you'll notice I had students splitting their options. I had students guessing. I had students who selected false confidence. Casey looks like they were falsely confident. And so that looks like, to me, a question where me as a teacher, I might want to spend some extra time really making sure that our students understand that concept and really digging into maybe their questions that they may have. And so again, this just kind of gives an overview of some of the features that InteDashboard does with the IRAT. We specifically talked a little bit about that confidence-based testing, and then that dashboard is what you just saw with the item analysis, and that gives you things like point by serials, percent correct, all the way down to how long the student took on each question, and that breakdown with our confidence-based testing. And I think that just, again, it gives the teachers maybe even more information than you need, but it really does let you kind of decide what to do with that information to support your students' learning.